Alright class, so we will learn about electrocardiogram in a bit, but before that we will let me explain you the electrical conductivity of the heart. You probably have done this in anatomy, so this is a very quick review. So this is my way of drawing the heart for electrical conductivity, and here you see the heart with 4 chambers. This is our right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle and left ventricle. Now in the posterior superior side of the right atrium there are a group of specialized cells, and these cells form a structure called SA node, also known as the pacemaker. SA stands for sinoatrial. Okay, then at the base here there is another group of specialized cells, and this is called the AV node, also known as atrioventricular node. So let me change color. Okay, the AV node then leads to the ventricle by a special group of cells here, and this is called the AV bundle. The AV bundle, after reaching the ventricle, divides into right bundle and left bundle. So this is the right bundle, this is the left bundle, and then terminates in these fibers called Purkinje fibers. So these are Purkinje fibers. What's the point? The point is that we already know that the human heart is autorhythmic, right? So it can generate its own heartbeat without any stimulation from the nervous system. So it is the cells at the SA node that generates the heartbeat. So how does that happen? Let me minimize it so I can change color. Okay, so the SA node starts firing action potentials, and the action potentials then spread all over the atria. So these are the action potentials that are generated from the SA node, and the action potential spreads all over the atria. So this is electricity, right, spreading over the atria. Okay, now remember one thing. We always have, and you have learned this in lecture, you always have an electrical event followed by mechanical event, right? So the point is, as these electricity or the action potential spreads all over the atria, immediately after that you will have atrial systole. Okay, so the action potential spreads all over the atria and hits the fibrous skeleton. This structure right here is fibrous skeleton. Now remember, the fibrous skeleton works as an insulator between the atria and the ventricles. So the moment the action potential hits the fibrous skeleton, 90% of the impulse dies down. However, the specialized cells of the AV node, this point, holds the signal for about 0.1 to 0.2 seconds. So the AV node holds the signal for 0.1 to 0.2 seconds and lets the signal pass through the AV bundle to the ventricle. So the signal now passes through the right bundle and left bundle, and then comes to the Purkinje fibers, and that is how all the ventricle or both the ventricles get the signal, and this is followed by ventricular systole. Okay, so what do we see here? Let's review this one more time. The SA node starts firing action potential, which spreads all over the atria. The action potential hits the fibrous skeleton and most of the signal dies down. The AV node, however, holds the signal for about 0.1 to 0.2 seconds and lets the signal pass along the AV bundle towards the ventricle. Reaching the ventricle, the signal passes through the right bundle and the left bundle, ultimately reaches the Purkinje fibers, and that initiates ventricular depolarization. followed by ventricular systole. So we see that the atria contracts first, right? So this is atrial systole. So right after both the atria gets depolarized, we will have atrial systole. And then right after both the ventricles get depolarized, we will have ventricular systole. Ventricular systole. So we have atrial systole followed by ventricular systole. Atrial systole followed by ventricular systole. Always, always. All right. So now remember another thing. Our body is a very, very good conductor of electricity. These electrical activity that are generated in the heart can be measured all over your body, and the process which helps us to record the electrical activity of the heart is called Electrocardiogram Ecg. However, in UK it's called EKG. It's the same thing. Okay, so we will talk about electrocardiogram. And this is my hand-drawn picture, and this is how the electrocardiogram looks like. Okay, the black lines that you see, this is the isoelectric line. Isoelectric line. Okay, so first in the ECG, you see a P wave. Do you see that in yellow? A P wave represents atrial depolarization. So atrial depolarization is denoted by the P wave. This is when the atria is getting depolarized by the action potential generated at the SA node. That's the atrial depolarization. This is followed by a short segment called the PR segment. This is not PQ segment. This is called PR segment. And the PR segment is the time when the AV node actually holds the signal. Remember, the AV node holds a signal for 0.1 to 0.2 seconds. At that time, we have the PR segment. Then we have another very, very prominent wave. This is called the Qrs complex. And the Qrs complex represents ventricular depolarization. This represents QRS. QRS. This is ventricular depolarization. Okay. Then we have ST wave. And ST wave is when the ventricles are starting to repolarize. So it's a phase between ventricular depolarization and ventricular repolarization. Okay. This is start of ventricular repolarization. And then T wave is when the ventricles are actually repolarized. So the T wave represents ventricular repolarization. So these are the different phases of the electrocardiogram. All right. Okay, class. So let's review. T wave represents atrial depolarization. QRS wave represents ventricular depolarization, and the T wave represents ventricular repolarization. PR segment is when the AV node is actually holding the signal for 0.1 to 0.2 seconds, and the ST segment represents the start of ventricular repolarization. All right, now let's take a look at this. So this is electrocardiogram straight from a textbook. You do see the P wave, QRS complex, and then the T wave, and you also see the PR interval and the ST interval here. We know what is the meaning of each wave and each segment or interval. So right here, this is another diagram taken from your textbook. We do see the heart, and along it we see the electrical activity. At the very bottom, you do see that yellow represents depolarization and green represents repolarization. So let's review this super quick. So when the atria just start, do you see there are two atria, right? When one atria starts depolarizing, we have the upward stroke of the P wave. When most of the atria is depolarized, we have partially formed P wave. When both the atria are depolarized, you see both the atria are yellow, then you have the full P wave. Then you also see the PR segment here in black. This is when the AV node is actually holding the signal before sending it towards the ventricles. Then here, if you look here, see the ventricle is getting depolarized as shown by the yellow arrows, and that is shown by the Qrs complex. And then when the ventricle is then before the ventricle starts repolarizing, so at this point it's 100% depolarized and it will start to repolarize, right? That is shown by this that is shown by the RT segment here, ST segment here in black. And then when the ventricle starts repolarizing, as shown by the little green shade in the ventricle, that is indicated by the T wave. Alright, so you can look at the electrical conductivity of the heart by placing electrodes anywhere on the body, and that is called electrocardiogram. Remember, your body is a very good conductor of electricity. Now looking at some abnormal conditions here. Okay, so arrhythmias or abnormal heart rhythms can be detected and described by abnormal ECG tracing, right? So a heartbeat occurs whenever a normal Qrs complex is seen. Now here we will talk about two conditions, bradycardia and tachycardia. A cardiac rate which is slower than 60 beats per minute is called bradycardia, and if the rate is actually faster than 100 beats per minute, it is called tachycardia. Now know that both bradycardia and tachycardia can occur normally, and in case of many endurance trained athletes, for example, they have resting heart rates ranging from about 40 to 60 beats per minute. Okay. Now, abnormal tachycardia occurs if the heart rate increases when the person is at rest. So you are resting, still your heart rate is very, very elevated. That is abnormal tachycardia. And this may be due to abnormal fast pacing by the atria or by the ventricle. And in this case, what happens is, in case of ventricular tachycardia, it results when abnormally fast ectopic pacemaker cells in the ventricles cause them to beat rapidly and independently of atria. So in case of ventricular tachycardia, you have some abnormal cells that behave as pacemaker cells and they pace up the ventricles super fast, and the beating is off. So the atria beats on its own and the ventricles beat on its own. And this is actually very, very dangerous because it can quickly degenerate into lethal conditions known as ventricular fibrillation, as you see at the bottom right picture here. People with ventricular fibrillation can live for only few minutes unless this is extended by CPR techniques or the fibrillation is ended by electrical defibrillation. Death is caused by inability of the ventricles to pump blood, and thus the heart cannot deliver needed oxygen to different parts of the body. So the patient dies in case of ventricular fibrillation. Alright, so I'll make another little short